Okay, so today we need to talk about something called the discriminant. Now, the thing that is important is we actually yesterday already found the discriminant. You didn't know it, but we actually already found it. And so the mechanics of finding the discriminant today is not new. What the discriminant is used for and what it means is. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So here we go. The b squared minus 4ac, that's the discriminant. And so yesterday when I think I highlighted it in blue and I said I want you to calculate that and show me what is that number under the radical, under the square root, that's going to be important today. That's why, okay? And there's a couple reasons why that's very important. Since it's under a square root, it tells us what kind of solutions we're going to get. Because as we now know, sometimes when you have negative numbers under a square root, what kind of numbers does that give us? If you have a negative under a square root. If a negative under a square root, you have to use what? The I, which means we have imaginary numbers. Okay, so if the discriminant, the b squared minus 4ac, is negative, that means I really have a negative under the square root, which means there are going to be complex solutions. Okay, if it's not negative, then it's going to give us some other things, and we're going to talk about those. Here's the next part. This is what the discriminant does. It tells us what types of solutions and actually how many you should get, and we're going to talk all about that today. And these are things that you're going to have to memorize because you're going to work through it on your homework today. You're going to work through it on your practice test on Monday, and then, of course, on your test on Tuesday. What types of solutions you should get. Now, I'm going to break down, based on what the discriminant is, what those solutions should be. Okay, and so the first one we've just been talking about. If you take b squared minus 4ac and it ends up being negative, that means you have an imaginary number, which means we have complex solutions. Okay, so if the discriminant is negative, you get complex solutions. Sometimes, and we talked about this, sometimes they will be called complex roots. Those mean the same thing. And the thing that's going to be nice for us is if we decide that it has complex solutions, then we're going to just stop there and say it has two complex solutions. And you could say imaginary solutions too, that would be okay. But then we're just going to stop and we're not going to keep going to find the actual imaginary solutions. Now, if we have a case where it's not negative, there's a couple things that can happen. Okay, first off, one of those things when it's not negative would mean discriminant could equal 0. And again, we can call this a rational root. If the discriminant equals 0, which it will, that means the square root basically drops out. That means the plus or minus drops out. And so we only get one rational solution because that's, and we've talked about this, negative b over 2a. That part of the quadratic formula, I don't know if you noticed that, because in the quadratic formula it's negative b plus or minus, and it's all over 2a. So there's a negative b and there's a 2a, and that was always the x-coordinate of our vertex. That was our equation for our axis of symmetry. So if the square root drops out because the discriminant is 0, then the plus or minus drops out, and so I have just a fraction left. And so when we say it's a rational solution, a rational root, then your answer is going to be a fraction or sometimes as a decimal. Okay? Then our last case, and then our last case actually has two cases within it. Okay? If the discriminant is positive, so we talked about negative, we talked about 0, and now we talk about positive. And those are problems you've already worked on. In your homework last night, your discriminant always turned out to be positive. What was under the square root was always positive. When that happens, you're going to get two real solutions. And all of our answers today, except for one, were decimals that you had to round. There was one problem where it came out exact. And I'm going to talk about what happens in that case in a second. So here's the special case when the discriminant is positive. When that number underneath the radical is a perfect square, meaning I can simplify it. So let's say it turned out to be 25. Square root of 25 is 5. I'm going to get some nice answers instead of decimals that I have to round. Okay, so when this happens, so if that discriminant is also a perfect square, then those two real solutions are rational. And the way that I would write that when that happens is I would just say two real rational roots. That's the way that I would write that if I was doing this homework. Because part of what you're going to do today is not even solve the whole thing. We're just going to decide what the answers should be. And then based off what we do, we may keep going to find the actual answers, but we may not. Go ahead and take a picture of this screen. Find the value of the discriminant for each quadratic equation, then describe the number and type of roots for the equation. Okay? So what we're going to be doing is basically categorizing our solutions, classifying our solutions. And it's all based on the discriminant. And fortunately for us, yesterday we spent a lot of time doing b squared minus 4ac. That was built into what we were doing. And so the thing that's going to be nice about your homework problems today is we maybe add a couple steps here, but they're small steps that you're going to need to do anyway in order to solve. So our first move, first off, is do I have one side equal to 0? Yes, I do. Okay, so what is A,
7,
B, and C?
5.
Okay, 5. So we got to identify those. That's important. Write those down. Just keep in the habit of doing that. A equals 7, B equals negative 11, C equals 5. Now, the discriminant, again, is just the b squared minus 4ac. No square root. No square root. Just b squared plus 4ac. So I want you, with those numbers, to figure that out. Remember, when you substitute them in, put them in parentheses. Put those numbers in parentheses when you substitute them in, and then you can do the rest on the calculator. Hopefully this is how you start. Okay? So again, notice how I put everything in parentheses. The negative 11 goes in its own set of parentheses. The 7 goes in its own set of parentheses. The 5 goes in its own set of parentheses. All right, now, you could do the rest of this in the calculator. I'm going to actually show the work. You don't have to, but I'm going to. This is 129. This is 140. I said 129. I meant 121. Sorry. 121. I know. Do you know why I said 29? Because there's a 9 when I subtract these. All right. 121 minus 140 is negative 19. That's where that 9 came from. Since the discriminant is negative, meaning the number that would go under the square root would be negative, what kind of solutions is that going to give me? Complex, imaginary. Because you have a negative number under the square root, that tells us we're going to have two complex solutions. You don't have to state it as a sentence like that, but I did. There are two complex roots. Now, what's important, and you need to hear this loud and clear, in your homework, eventually they're going to ask for solutions. And that this will be the first two steps. The third step will be solve it. in your homework and in the directions that I put in the homework, if the discriminant ends up being negative, you do not need to solve it. You just stop. Okay? All right, so that is the solution. That's it. That's all they asked us to do. So we are done with that problem. Let's do another one. This time I want you to write it down. Okay? X squared plus 22x plus 121 equals 0. All right, one side already equals 0, so that's good. What is A? 1. What is B? 22. And C? 121. Okay, so we want to identify those. Go ahead and find the discriminant. Okay, so if you subbed in correctly, this is what you should have had. 22 squared minus 4 times 1 times 121. Again, notice, put everything in parentheses. What does this give me? 0. 484 minus 484 is 0. Okay, so when the discriminant is 0, there is only one rational root. Again, rational just means it's a fraction. And I know I said this before, I'll say it again. When the discriminant is 0, that means the square root drops out. That means the plus or minus drops out. My answer is negative b over 2a. Okay, so there's only going to be one rational root. You could say real and rational, that's fine. But we can say just rational. All right, the last thing that you're going to have to do in your homework, because this would be a problem, and I think we're going to do it. If I remember, I do remember, would be a part C, where it says, then find the roots, then find the solutions, okay? So on this next page, I want you to take a picture of this, because these directions are what you will see in your homework. Take a picture of this, please. So when you get to problems like this in your homework, I want you to notice something. Part A says, find the value of the discriminant. We've just been doing that on the last page. We did that. And then part B says, describe the number and types of roots. We've been doing that too. So those first two steps that we did for the last two problems are on our way to doing part C, find the exact solutions. Now, I know it says exact, okay? It's not going to always be exact. Sometimes we're going to round to the nearest hundredth, which is how many places? 2 decimal places. We aren't going to be so concerned with exact solutions, unless they come out to be exact. So don't worry about that. And again, in the directions that I gave you in Canvas, it will say round to the nearest hundredth or 2 decimal places. Okay. So we're going to use the very last problem that we just did. So you can copy paste and sort of put it under there if you want, because this was what we just did on the last page. So this was part A and B. We did that for part A and B on the last page. It's just the same work that we just had up there. Now, for part C, I guess I covered that up, didn't I? Okay, there. Now we can see that. So for part C, we now need to find the solutions. Well, now I go back to the quadratic formula. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. But we did the b squared minus 4ac part, and that was always the hardest part of the problem anyway. So what I have now, this is the thing that's nice about these problems. Part A makes me do the hardest part of the quadratic formula already. And so when I go to find the exact solutions, I can just plug in that 0. And so now when we're going to actually find the solutions, that number, that discriminant, goes in underneath the radical. My negative b, since b was positive, it turns negative. My a was 1. And like I said, this was the hardest part of our homework yesterday. And so in reality, what I have here is negative 22 divided by 2. Because I've been saying, when the discriminant is 0, the square root just drops out. Well, what's negative 22 divided by 2? Negative 11. That is my solution. This one turned out to be exact. And what's important is whenever the discriminant is 0, you will get an exact rational root. And I did. I got one rational root. If it's 2 rational real roots, then you'll get 2 of them like this. If it's just 2 real, that's when you're going to have 2 decimals. If this number ends up being negative, let me move this again. Okay. If what happens in step 1 and 2 gives me a negative number, then you do not do part C. Okay, that's what's going to happen in your homework today, if it's negative.